Hi friends, Rick Edwards here. Thank you for joining me for another lesson from the Gospel Project. Today we're going to be looking at a core passage taken from the book of 1 Kings chapter 2 verses 1 through 4 and then skipping over to chapter 3 verses 3 through 15. Now you'll notice we're early in the book of Kings because this is our first entry into the book of Kings. As we're making our way through the Old Testament, we're now entering into the book of 1 Kings. Now, just a little background as a reminder, as the case was with Samuel, it was originally one scroll or one book that, because of its size and length, was divided into two. That's why we have a 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel. They're two books, but in fact, they're one cohesive story told all at once. Same thing with 1 Kings and 2 Kings. Two books, but they were originally one scroll that, because of length, was divided into two. And it's important to know that Kings, the book of Kings, inclusive of both 1st and 2nd Kings, Kings is a sequel to Samuel. So when you're reading through Samuel, you can go right on into the book of Kings, or 1st and 2nd Kings, and just pick up where the history left off. Actually, it's going to begin with David's death at the beginning of 1 Kings. So it's a very natural transition going from David's death into the various kings, the many kings that followed David. We'll talk about why that's significant. But David's death occurred somewhere around 970 BC. And then the book of Kings takes us all the way into the Babylonian exile, which typically we mark the beginning of the exile somewhere around 586, when Babylon conquered Jerusalem and destroyed the temple. But the story actually goes into about 560 BC in the book of 1st and 2nd Kings. So these two books, or one book, if you think of them as one book called Kings, covers more than 400 years of history in the Old Testament story, of Israel's story. Okay? Now, it's important to understand that the book of Kings demonstrates, when you look at the whole book as a whole, demonstrates the inadequacy of the monarchy to accomplish God's purposes. Okay? But there's hope. Well, let's just break that down just for a moment. You'll recall we went through the period of the judges, and that didn't work very well. So we moved into the period of the kings of the monarchy, starting with Saul and then David and then Solomon, where we read about Solomon in 1 Kings. But now we're discovering that not only did the period of the judges not work, not only did that political arrangement not work, the confederation or the confederacy, but the monarchy is not working either. All these kings demonstrate their failures over and over and over until Israel basically becomes unable to function and is conquered by Babylon, and the people are carried into exile. But the interesting thing is, when you get to the end of 2 Kings, it ends rather abruptly, but it ends talking about a king, the king at the time, and how he has given some freedom in Babylon. So there's this element of hope. And as you move through the book of 1st and 2nd Kings, we'll note this as we go through, there is often a messianic expectation or anticipation or hope, so that when you get to the end of 2 Kings, it's pretty obvious that the monarchy, this system that has been set up under these kings, is not working to accomplish God's plan. But there's hope that his plan is still going to be accomplished through his plan to bring a Messiah. We'll touch on that many, many times. Now, what this means is that as we get into today's text, today's story, which is all about Solomon, it's apparent that Solomon is part of a bigger story, and we have to always remember that. Any given king or any given personality like David or Solomon or Samuel, some of these big biblical heroes, any one of these personalities only fulfill a particular piece of the puzzle or a piece of the story. And Solomon is only part of a bigger story. And in this case, the bigger story goes back to, well, really it all goes all the way back to Genesis, but more specifically, we find what's happening with Solomon makes the most sense when you go back to 2 Samuel chapter 7, when God establishes what we call the Davidic covenant. And we've spoken about the Davidic covenant before. So it's in that context now that we're seeing things unfold and develop in the book of 1 Kings. Now, I want to suggest that perhaps you start your class with this question. Have you ever yourself, or have you ever noticed someone, observed someone, who goes through a difficult circumstance? Maybe it's a season of illness, the loss of a loved one. Anyway, there's a difficult season, and you or someone you observe is left wondering, why did this happen? Why did God allow this to happen? And then sometime later, something happens, and you or the person begins to say, you know what? I'm beginning to understand why things happened the way they did. Now that some time has passed, I believe God was doing this in my life as a result. Now, we have to be a little careful about that, because sometimes we blame God for things that He wasn't necessarily responsible for. But the point here is that sometimes in our lives, we look at a particular set of circumstances and we don't understand why these things happen the way they did. But when we are given a little time, we are able to look back and say, oh, okay, it makes a little more sense to me now when I get the bigger picture. And what I want you to understand today, and what we're going to see, is that there is a bigger picture of God's plan unfolding throughout the entire Bible. And what we need to do as Christians is understand that we are merely a part of a bigger story, a bigger plan. So that question, allow people to talk about this, because they will inevitably, a number of them, if not all of them, will be able to say, yeah, there were times in my life when I didn't understand what was going on, but now in retrospect, looking back, I can see how God was working, God was doing certain things in my life, because we need to be able to step back at any point in our lives and see that we are part of a bigger picture. Now, some things that I would point out about today's text or today's story is that it begins by revealing David's blessing on Solomon as he chooses Solomon and arranges for Solomon to become his successor, the next king of Israel. But David does that, so he blesses Solomon by saying, you're going to be the king. We're going to make this happen. But he does so, if you'll notice, in that text, chapter 2, verses 1 through 4, he references the covenant that God established with him back in 2 Samuel chapter 7. So even David, at the beginning of the book of 1 Kings, David is saying to Solomon, your life, your reign, your function as king is going to take place and happen in the context of the covenant that God established with me years before this. So it's important to understand that the covenant, the Davidic covenant, is relevant even as we move into 1 Kings. So the text today, the core passage, reveals David's blessing related to the covenant, and then it reveals Solomon's humility. You'll see that as you look at the text. You'll see how humble Solomon is. He basically says, I don't know how to run this nation. I don't know how to be a king to these people. And so he asks God for wisdom because he is a humble individual. And God is pleased with that. And consequently, God blesses Solomon. We see David's blessing, we see Solomon's humility, and then we see God's blessing as God says to Solomon, because you asked for wisdom and discernment rather than wealth, I'm going to give you both. I'm going to give you wisdom and I'm going to give you wealth and power as a king. And in fact, he does that throughout Solomon's reign. So these things help us understand what's happening at the beginning of 1 Kings and how God is blessing Solomon. He's coming into his life saying, you are picking up now the mantle, so to speak. You are picking up the rule of your father David. So you now become part of the covenant, Solomon. So this is really what the story is about. The story is about the continuation of the Davidic covenant in the person of Solomon. So the text, the story, the author of 1 Kings kind of makes a big deal out of this whole thing. The fact that Solomon is now picking up the Davidic covenant and becoming part of the Davidic covenant. And he's going to do many, many great things. Like David, we're going to discover that Solomon had a season of success and blessing, but like David, Solomon also made some bad choices and ultimately experiences the judgment of God and the consequences of his bad decisions in his life. But today's story is emphasizing the continuation of the covenant through Solomon. Okay? So, what's our takeaway? I would just note that if we want to make an application of today's story, it's that we need to live in light of God's bigger plan. All of us tend to look at life through the lens of our own ambitions, our own expectations, our own hopes. But as Christians, we need to step back and say, what is God attempting to accomplish in this world? What is God attempting to accomplish in history? And then we live our lives in light of God's plan, just as Solomon had to learn to do. And in today's core passage, Solomon humbles himself and says, okay, I want to be part of God's plan, part of the Davidic covenant, and I need God's wisdom to accomplish that. So now in our lives, God calls us to live in light of God's plan because, just as with Solomon, God says, I'm going to accomplish my purposes. I am going to do what I want to do. I am going to fulfill my promise to David. I'm going to fulfill my promise to even humanity that goes all the way back to Genesis. So God is going to accomplish his purposes. Therefore, we need to live in light of what God's plan is, which means every single one of us. Sometimes we might think, well, who am I that God would notice me? Well, Solomon said the same thing. But the reality is God does see us, God knows us, and God has a plan within which he calls us to live. We are part of his plan. We are part of his unfolding plan, part of his unfolding story. And that's what we need to take away from today's core text, is that God is doing something big, and even Solomon was just a piece of that plan. And you and I are just a piece of God's plan, and we need to live in light of God's plan, bigger plan, and the specific plan he has for each of our lives. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.